Hi, welcome to the Bible channel. In this penultimate video, number 5 from a series of 6, we address the subject, the gospel of peace. What does eye for an eye really mean? Was it about brutal revenge or something deeper? In this eye-opening Bible talk, we unpack the true meaning behind this controversial principle and how it applies today. Click the link in the end credits to watch the whole series. Leave a comment and let us know what you think. We would love to hear from you.
Today, as we look at an eye for an eye, additionally, I thought it worked out really well that we read 1 Kings 19 today. I just wanted to put that out there, that if you've been thinking a lot about how does this peace that we've been talking about, how does it look and how does it work, I find the Elijah story to be fascinating in that because I think in Elijah, you see someone who did not initially embrace peace. And this is why you see him, as Romans 11 says, he was praying to God against Israel. Right? And we just read it in 1 Kings 19, that he's saying, they've done all these things, right? They've broken the law like this, like this, like this. And he has to be taught, he has to be shown that, well, that's not exactly the way that God was doing things. So if you're interested in that, I put together a series on Elijah. So if you want to check that out and look further into how this peace stuff goes together, that's kind of like a part 2. You can find that online. Okay, with that said, we're going to talk today about an eye for an eye. So yesterday, we really put together this idea, the foundation, that the law requires us to look deeper. Now, I think that's really exciting. And I was having a conversation with a few of you yesterday about how this is just how God works, right? It's almost like it's God's signature, that here he gives us something that requires us to go deeper. Isn't that what we have in Scripture? God didn't just give us a list of here's the first principles, the end, but it's this whole book of here you go. Now figure this out. Spend time thinking about it. Let it go in and change who you are. And so that's really what we're going to note today, that in fact, it wasn't just that way with some of the somewhat random laws that we looked at yesterday, like don't mix fabrics, but it was actually that way with all of the laws. That when God gave all of the laws, he wanted people to spend time on each law saying, why does this law exist? And to recognize it wasn't actually about what the law said, but it was about something deeper. And as we saw yesterday, the big challenge is that sometimes that something deeper that God was teaching is actually the opposite of what the law says. You have to look deeper. And I think the big thing that God wanted people to see is he wanted them to say, I know who God is. He reveals his character. This is why he reveals his character in Exodus 34, in the middle of giving the law. He reveals his character so that people can say, that's who God is. Merciful, gracious, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth. We know who he is. How does that fit with these commands? And to interpret the commands in light of that character. So that's what we are going to see as we go through specifically when God commands his people to kill and commands an eye for an eye. So how do we fit all that together? First, we're just going to do a little bit of an overview of Old Testament violence, which is probably sounds a little bit weird, but this is an important thing for us to look at. Next, we will talk about thou shalt not kill. We'll look at that commandment, and then we will talk about what is the principle there. Now, this is the main message, and I think this is a little bit challenging because very few people see it this way. All of the law supports peace and love. Now, you might recognize I'm really just alluding to a handful of verses in the New Testament. Didn't the Apostle Paul tell us this? Didn't Lord Jesus tell us that same thing? The first and second greatest commandments. That's what the law is about. The law is about peace and love. So I think we have that as a foundation. The question is, well, how do we get there? How is it that we can look at some of these commands and say, right, an eye for an eye teaches you to love your neighbor. How? Right? Like, if somebody took my eye, I wouldn't be like, wow, you must love me a lot. Like, that's not, that's not how that works. So what is going on there? Somehow that teaches love. And again, I think we don't often, we know that. We know the law in general is about love, but we don't often come down to the specific commands and ask ourselves, how does this fit? So here's a why question for you as well. Why was Israel told to kill? Now, that's an interesting thing to ponder, particularly because I think, at least for me, I did not recognize how often Israel was told to kill people. Because we don't live under that law. We think about, oh yeah, they were told to kill the Canaanites, but that was just kind of a one-time thing. That's true, but there was a lot more than just that. So let's take a look at that. Now, I want to tell you a story to start with, just because, again, I think it's imperative for us to understand this. I was once at an ecclesia, which will remain nameless, and a visiting brother was there giving the exhortation, and this is how it went. This is why I think it's so important for us to understand this. The visiting brother was there, and he got up, and he was talking about the conquest of Canaan. Great biblical subject. I think that's a good thing for us to think about. As he's talking about it, he starts discussing how Israel was supposed to destroy and kill all the Canaanites. Finally, he gets to his big crescendo, and I'm expecting something like, well, we have to stand against the world. We can't let worldly values in or something like that. But he says, and who are the Canaanites? All the people in the world. So I was like, yeah, okay. I kind of see that. And then he posed the question and he said, so should we kill all the people in the world just like Israel should kill all the Canaanites? And I was like, well, obviously not, right? That's really not good. Clearly, that's not what God wanted. And he said, no. And I was like, oh, good. Right? You never know sometimes where things are going to go. And he said, no. But then he proceeded to say, no, because there's not enough bullets. And I was like, what? This is the direction that this went, right? And at the time, we had somebody who is now a sister, who is a close friend of mine. She was there. She was not baptized. She's sitting there in the audience. And you know what she does? She stands up in the middle of memorial service and leaves, right? And I was like, yeah, I probably would have done that too. If I was not a Christadelphian and just listened to somebody say they would kill me if they had enough bullets, like that, that probably wasn't very good, to say an understatement. So I put that out there just because, I recognize that's not hopefully how any of us think. But sometimes people get to that, right? We can sometimes get weird stuff when we come to these stories and when we see this violence, and we need to not have that weird stuff, right? This is the kind of stuff that we actually need to recognize. Wait a minute. These stories that are about violence, they actually teach peace and love. They don't teach that you need to manufacture more bullets, right? That's not the idea behind these stories. So what's the idea going on here? Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about Old Testament violence. Now, it's interesting. You may have heard before this whole idea of there being a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New. Have you heard that? Have you heard somebody say that to you before? That's not typically a thing that you'll hear within Christadelphia, although I have heard a few talks in which people have said that, which I think is weird. But that's a thing that happens. Usually it's non-Christadelphians. Typically you'll hear it in a lot of Christians. This is an interesting quote, an academic source here by a Christian writer. And I thought it was interesting what he noted as far as the sources and Christians that he had heard say this. So consider the reasoning for this God of the Old Testament, God of the New Testament that this writer gives. He says, at some time or other, you have probably heard it said that one significant difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament is that the God of the Old Testament is a God of justice, while the God of the New Testament is a God of love. This is often presented as if it were some wise insight into the Bible, which is then supported by the numerous stories of God's wrathful vengeance that marks so much of the Old Testament, in contrast with Christ's emphasis on God's fatherly, forgiving nature. If you have heard this, it was probably from a Christian, as there is in it an implicit, faintly anti-Semitic criticism of Judaism, with a suggestion that God in the Old Testament needed to be so strict because of the obstinate behavior of the Jews. Now, that's an interesting observation that this writer makes, and I would concur with that typically, if you will talk to these people further and say, so why do you think that the God of the Old Testament had to act like that? Right? Then they will say, oh, well, because this is what the Jews needed. Or just because, well, that's how God decided to interact with the Jews. So there's usually some kind of misunderstanding about the role of the Jewish people in the plan of God. That behavior was so bad and so incorrigible that God decided a new covenant was called for, hence Jesus. And so not only do you have a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New Testament, but you have a God of the Old Covenant and a God of the New Covenant. And you will note that, again, this matches with a lot of Christian theology. I do not mean to charge all those who make this distinction between the two portrayals of God with anti-Semitism, but I do want to point out that this distinction is heir to a very ancient bias against Jews. Now, my point, again, in bringing this out is, number one, it's very easy to just get confused with what's going on here. We could go swing to one side by thinking you're supposed to kill all the Canaanites. We could swing to the other side by becoming anti-Jewish, right, with these different kinds of ideas. Now, the good thing is, as Christadelphians, I think we often recognize, we have such a big emphasis on reading in context, and we recognize the role of God's people, the Jews, in his plan, that we fall more along the lines of this quote. It says, further, somewhat like the role of the slow-witted disciples in the Gospels, the picture of a bumbling Israel allows the reader to see the truth more clearly. No one could confuse the ideal Israel with the historical reality. Neither could anyone miss the point that Yahweh's dealings with his people were characterized more by mercy than by justice. In other words, we recognize the God of the Old Testament is actually a God of mercy. And he says, I'm going to destroy you, but he waits 500 years to do that. So we recognize this. But there are twin dangers in this phenomenon of portraying Israel as continual lying, falling short of the mark, dangers that the history of exegesis shows have caused great damage. For many readers, the prophetic emphasis on God's judgment has led to the conclusion that the God of the Old Testament is demanding and full of vengeance. Such conclusions come, I think this is a really important sentence, from atomistic readings. That means reading under a microscope, just paying attention to that one verse, and are not possible when the prophets are studied carefully in their historical and canonical context. So what that means is, in their historical context, that's where they are out there talking to the people, calling for mercy, and their canonical context is how it fits with the rest of the emphasis of the Old Testament. An emphasis on the character of God, merciful, gracious, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth. Okay, so I would say that as Christadelphians, we often don't fall into this trap. You may find that your Christian friends might bring it up, but sometimes we hear it. You may also hear it from atheists. Do you recognize this quote? You maybe have seen it before. This is one of those crazy Richard Dawkins quotes. So teaching at university, this is the kind of thing that people bring up to me, and they will specifically bring it up because of the genocide of the Canaanites. Right? They will say, so I've been asked to teach on this specifically at different universities. I've been asked to go to other churches and teach on this, right, which is one of those funny things. They will say, try and please explain this to us because our members don't want to read the Bible anymore because they say it's genocidal. Right? Can you explain this to us? And I'll say, well, yeah, as long as I can say whatever I want to say, then I'll come and I'll go to your church and I'll talk about this. But people will bring up this quote. So this is Richard Dawkins, a professor at Oxford. He is a well-known atheist, right? And this is what he says. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochist, capriciously malevolent bully. Oh my goodness. So basically, he was just trying to use a lot of big words and sound cool. The But you get the idea, right? He's just saying that he sees God as this angry, mean God. And this is one of the reasons that he says the Bible is not true. Now, again, as I said, Christadelphians don't often fall into this, but some do. So what you see here on the screen, you'll note there is no source. I didn't want to put it up there. This is a book written by an ex-Christadelphian. And he lists this as one of the reasons that he left. So you can see that sometimes you have this whole, there's not enough bullets thing, and stuff like that leads to this, right? So this is what he says. If a morality system was derived entirely and only from the Bible, it would look quite different from what are considered Christian morals. For example, in some places, the Bible condones or even instructs genocide, slavery, rape, murder, lying, infanticide, and so on. Christians ignore or explain away these unpleasant parts of the Bible and emphasize the nicer sections about love, mercy, kindness, and so on. So you can even hear in this implicit this idea that one testament is against the other, that one God is against the God of love. So this is a thing that I think, I put all of this up here because I think it's important for us to be able to explain this. And in fact, not just explain it, but to be able to say to people, whether they are Christian or atheist or ex-Christadelphian or still Christadelphian, that it's important for us to be able to say, whoa, if you don't think the law is about peace, then you totally misunderstood the law. And so we need to go back and we need to talk about this some more. Now, to introduce then that idea, I want to just ask you, well, first, just a statement here. When I was a teenager, I already told you kind of how I was, but I decided that the most exciting parts of the Bible were the gory stories. That was my favorite part. My favorite one was 1 Samuel 15, where Samuel hacked Agag in pieces. So I put little stars next to those verses. And I made a collection of those stories in the back of my Bible. That was actually the first class I ever taught. It was a kids class, and Brother Levi Jeleno and I, we got together and we said, all right, we're going to teach this kids class. We don't really know how to teach anything, but we'll teach this class. So we prepared something on, it was like 2 Kings 5 or something like that. It wasn't a gory story at all, but we said, this is a good, appropriate story for kids. And we taught it, and it only lasted about 10 minutes because we didn't know what we were doing. And so we had another half hour. So I said, oh, don't worry, kids. I have some great stories to tell you. And I opened up into the back of my Bible, and we went through all the gory stories. There was one girl in the class, and afterwards she was like, I never had any idea that was in there. So anyway, poor girl. Okay. So these were the stories that I thought were really interesting, really cool. Thing is that I don't think I really understood them. Didn't really understood what was actually going on. So let me just ask you, maybe you have your own list. Let's just keep to the book of Genesis. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but again, as we're considering peace and the Old Testament, it's important for us to recognize why people would come to this conclusion. Why would they say that the Old Testament is full of violence? So let's just take a survey here. Can you think of any violent stories in Genesis? Just shout it out if you have them. Cain and Abel, Shechem, destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the flood. Now, I would just want to pause at this one. Here's one of those things. I think we miss a lot of the violent stories because they're stories that we read as kids' books, or we tell them to our kids before they're going to bed. So like we kind of sanitize them a little bit because we want them to sleep, right? So, but if we call it the story of Noah and the flood, but if we called it the story of how God killed 2 million people, right? Then probably the kids would be like, like I can't sleep. What's going to happen? Like, and they'd be freaked out of rain, like, and all this kind of thing. So like we changed it a little bit. But if you actually stop and think about it, that story is really violent, right? That's an important thing to think about. You even have like people knocking on the door of the ark trying to get in, right? That's traumatizing to little children, right? So we leave that part out too. But that's something to think about. Okay. Anything else in Genesis?
Abraham going after the mountains.
Abraham runs after the king of Mesopotamia, right? With 300 people. It's like this crazy story, but again, it's violent, right? Okay. How about Joseph getting thrown into a pit? The whole like blood on the coat thing. Now, again, here's the funny thing. We're so used to the stories of Genesis that I don't think we often recognize, oh, there is a lot of violent stuff here, right? We kind of just process it. Okay, here's what I put together. I have Cain and Abel, as you said, Noah and the flood, Abram rescuing Lot, Sodom and Gomorrah, Isaac and Ishmael, right? Ishmael taunting Isaac, all of that sort of thing. Jacob and Esau, Esau wanting to murder his brother. Joseph and his brothers. How about this? Here's some in Exodus. Moses kills the Egyptian. There's the 10 plagues. You have the Red Sea killing all the Egyptians, right? The golden calf destroying the Canaanites. The man who gathers sticks and is stoned. You have Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and Phinehas. There's a lot there. Now, again, a lot of times, the people who are being violent are the good guys, or even God, right? So sometimes when we tell these stories, we say, oh, look, and there's this great deliverance. The Israelites, they went through the Red Sea, and the Egyptians, they got crushed in the sea, but they deserved it. And then, we move on. And that's true. So I'm not trying to minimize that at all. But at the same time, that's a lot of people dying, right? And it's God who did that. And it's the kind of thing that when people look at these stories and they haven't looked at them before, they're kind of like, whoa, that's kind of a violent God. What do you do with that? So I bring that out there just because we probably haven't heard about it that much. Now, as you progress through the history, right, you get to the stories that were in my gory story list. You have Othniel and the war with Mesopotamia. How about Ehud and Eglon? That was one of the best, I thought. The whole sword disappearing thing. That was my favorite. Okay. Then you have Deborah and Barak and the war with Sisera, the tent peg, right? And this is one that anyway, we don't need to talk about this. But you have Gideon and the war with Midian. You have Abimelech and Shechem. He gets a millstone thrown on his head. I thought that was really cool. You have Jephthah and the war with Ammon, Samson and the war with Philistia. You have the Danites and Micah, and then the Levite, the concubine, and civil war. This is basically every story in Judges is about people dying, war, something gross and bloody happening, right? This is how it goes. And so you can understand, I think when we put these lists together, you can understand why somebody who just reads the stories for the first time and then says, whoa, the God of the Old Testament is different than I thought God was. You can sort of understand that feeling. And I think that's an important spot to be. It's important to be able to understand that feeling. Now, that continues even as you go through the prophets. So there's a lot that the prophets say about taking care of the poor, kindness, but they also say this. This is Isaiah 10, verses 3 and 4. This is talking to Israel. It says, what will you do on the day of reckoning when disaster comes from afar? To whom will you run for help? Where will you leave your riches? Nothing will remain but to cringe among the captives or fall among the slain. Yet for all this, his anger is not turned away. His hand is still upraised. And so in the prophets, you get this idea of a God who is destroying the people of Israel and whose wrath is still not finished. Here's Jeremiah. Jeremiah 5, verses 9 to 10. Should I not punish them for this, declares the Lord? Should I not avenge myself on such a nation as this? Go through her vineyards and ravage them, but do not destroy them completely. Strip off her branches, for these people do not belong to the Lord. So you can see there's a lot there. We have to lay that foundation first, so that when somebody comes to us and says, hey, the God of the Old Testament is very different than the God of the New Testament. Jesus comes and he preaches love. That's not what I see in the Old Testament. Then we can say to them, I understand why you feel that way, but I don't think that's the case. So is it true? Is the God of the Old Testament violent and vengeful while the God of the New Testament is full of mercy? Well, we know the answer is no. We know that's not true. So how do we explain that? Well, that's what we looked at yesterday. You can have the commandments, and then you have the principles that are really what the commandments are all about. So that's what I want us to look at today. Now, again, because we don't live under the law, we don't often think about what this would have looked like on a day-to-day basis. But I want you to imagine this. Imagine being an Israelite and you are listening to the 10 Commandments. So here you go, one of the 10 Commandments. So this is one of the set-apart commands that God is specifically giving his people. Exodus 20, verse 13, you hear, you shall not murder. You shall not murder. Or you shall not kill, depending on which translation you read. Now then in the next chapter, similar period of time, consider what else you read. Exodus 21, verses 12 to 14. Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are to flee to a place I will designate. If anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. Now, I think when God gave this first commandment here, the 10 Commandments, it would have been really interesting for the people because you have all the stories that we had just talked about back in Genesis. All these stories of Esau wanting to kill Jacob, of Joseph's brothers wanting to kill him, all of this. And you could have said, okay, you shall not murder. Those things were clearly bad, that those people wanted to do that. So you can acknowledge that. And then in the next chapter, when God gives this command, do you notice what would have been difficult to figure out? I put to you, we often go the exception route here. But just think about, there is a contradiction in this text with this text too. Do you see what the contradiction is? If somebody kills someone else deliberately, what are you supposed to do then? Kill them. But didn't God just say not to do that? Now that's interesting. And you might be thinking, well, obviously it's okay because God says to do it here. But I want to just put to you, you know what kind of thinking that is? That's exception thinking. And I think that God specifically says, don't kill anybody. Oh, but by the way, if someone kills somebody else, kill them. Because he wanted the people to say, wait a minute. How's this work? You said not to kill people, but you just told us to kill somebody. That doesn't fit together, right? And to wrestle with this and to say, what's going on here? What's the deeper idea? What are you really trying to get at? Now, by the way, just to make this clear, I know this is a political debate sometimes. I'm not trying to say anything about capital punishment. Okay, so don't get into that. Don't start thinking about that. My point is that when God gave this, though, I think he wanted the people to say, how does this work? You just said anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. Oh, and if you do it deliberately, then you definitely have to die. But clearly, if we go and kill that person for killing somebody else, we're killing them deliberately. So what happens to us? You know, it just begins this whole cycle if you follow the law to the letter, right? Like, it gets crazy. So then all of a sudden, all of Israel's dead, right? Like, because one guy killed somebody else, so you killed that person, somebody has to kill you, and then somebody has to kill that person. Like, it turns into this crazy cycle. And for people who are lawyers, who are debating and thinking about what does the letter of the text mean, you can't escape that. Unless you go the exception route. Now, by the way, God keeps emphasizing this. You'll actually note that almost every time that he brings out this idea of when someone kills someone else, you always have that person has to be put to death. Right? You get, don't kill somebody, and if somebody kills someone else, they have to die. Right? He continuously brings this up. So here's Leviticus 24:17. Anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. Now, again, I think if you were an Israelite, you'd be thinking about this and you'd say, wait a minute, how does that help? Right now, it might be helpful in a preventative measure. Right? I want to acknowledge that because you would say, okay, I don't want to die, so I'm not going to kill that person. But a lot of times that isn't how it works. Right? People don't sit down and weigh out the cost of killing somebody else. Right? You know, maybe sometimes they do, but typically it's not the kind of thing that you look at and you say, oh, okay, it's worth it. Right? Now, I'm not speaking from experience, just to make that clear. Okay, Numbers 35, it's the same thing. Or if anyone is holding a stone and strikes someone a fatal blow with it, that person is a murderer. The murderer is to be put to death. So you get this cyclical problem in which the person who kills must be put to death, and then it would just continue that way. Now, this is not just a thing for somebody who kills someone else, but God gave that commandment in a number of cases. Leviticus 20 verse 2, he says, "Say to the Israelites, any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Molech is to be put to death. The members of the community are to stone him." Now, again, I put to you, God says in the 10 Commandments, don't kill anybody. And then as the laws continue to be given, he says, oh, kill that person and kill that person. And for the diligent Israelite who's reading the law, there had to be this question of, you just told me not to kill people, but then you said kill all these people. How does that make any sense? What does that mean? What were you getting at? Numbers 35:19. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death. When the avenger comes upon the murderer, the avenger shall put the murderer to death. Deuteronomy 21:21. Then all the men of the town are to stone him to death. You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear of it and be afraid. Now, that's just on an individual basis, but this continues to get even larger when God then says, you're going to enter the land and you're going to kill all the Canaanites. So we have it there in Deuteronomy chapter 7. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations, notice this. We don't often think of this in this light. 7 nations larger and stronger than you. So you see what's being said? These are big countries. And so when God says destroy these, he's not just saying destroy this little city. He's saying destroy this huge country, this big tribe of people. And I think this is put out not only to say it's going to be hard, but also to say this should challenge your conscience, right? What's going on here? God said, do not kill. And now he says, go out and kill all these people. And they had to say, wait a minute, God, what's going on here? What do you mean by this? God then says something that I think is astonishing. And again, we get used to this. And this is the kind of thing that leads us to say there's not enough bullets. But listen to this. When the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you have defeated them, you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. Now, that's interesting, I think. Show them no mercy. And we read that and we say, right, they were supposed to be incredibly harsh towards them. And yet it's fascinating to think, when did God say, and I absolutely love it when you hate mercy, right? And that's fascinating. Now, by the way, don't get the wrong idea here. I'm not saying they were supposed to be friends with the Canaanites or anything like that. You got to wait till the exhortation to see how this comes together. Sorry, another cliffhanger. But there's a lot that we have to establish as we look at this. But I would just put to you that when he says show them no mercy, that should have been an indication to people, because they would have said, wait a minute, God, you said I am merciful, gracious, long-suffering, and now you're telling us to not show mercy. How does that work? What does that mean? There's things where we just read this here, and I think we don't often consider that this should have been hard for them to understand, and God did that on purpose. Right? He wanted them to be challenged by these words and to say, this doesn't fit with what you told us about yourself. Deuteronomy 7 verse 16, it says, you must destroy all the peoples the Lord your God gives over to you. Do not look on them with pity. Do not serve their gods, for that will be a snare to you. Now, I want you to notice, by the way, when we go the exception route, you remember what happens? The commands get way bigger. So note this. Here's the original commands. Again, somewhat straightforward, but when we go the exception route, I want you to see what happens. Here's the commands. Number 1, do not kill, right? That's Exodus chapter 20. Number 2, but kill those who do kill and who break other laws. And then number 3, kill the Canaanites. So those are your 3 straightforward commands. Here's what happens when you go the exception route. Well, let me show you the exception route. This is the way that a number of people for a time in Judaism went, and they actually figured out that it doesn't work, which is interesting, and I'll show you that. It goes like this. Exodus 20 verse 13. You might have noticed that it says, you shall not murder. Now, our legal brains might have said, oh, it said murder. Well, that's different than killing, right? You could accidentally take the life of something, and that's killing it. But murdering, that's where you purposefully go out and do it. And you could maybe build up a case on that. So here's your word. It's ratzach in Hebrew. And it is repeatedly used about killing other Israelites. So like if you go out in the camp and you kill another Israelite, something like that. So you could very easily say, see, this is only about Israelites. So therefore, when God says to kill the Canaanites, this doesn't have anything to do with that because it's a different word. So here's an example for you, 3 examples of how this word, ratzach, is specifically used in reference to killing Israelites. So it says there in Numbers 35, verse 6, 6 of the towns you give the Levites will be cities of refuge to which a person who has killed someone may flee. And that again is talking about killing other Israelites. Deuteronomy 19, verse 3, determine the distances involved. This is again about the cities of refuge. And divide into 3 parts the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, so that a person who kills someone may flee for refuge to one of those cities. Again, about killing other Israelites. And then in Hosea chapter 4, verse 2, you'll see it in the prophets as well, that God says, there's a problem here in my nation. And that problem is, there's only cursing, lying, and murder. In other words, Israelites killing other Israelites. So you can build up this case, and our legal brains can say, well, when God gave the law, and he said, thou shalt not kill, what he really meant was, thou shalt not kill, parentheses, Israelites. Because that's typically how this word is used. So, if you wanted to go out and kill anybody else, that was totally fine. Now, you could probably see the problem in this, right? God was not saying, oh, and if you just want to go south into India, yeah, go kill all them, that's great, right? That's not what was happening. But that's, again, where exceptions can lead. Right? You create little loopholes, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh wait, this loophole is a little bigger than I thought it was. And you run into problems. Now, here's another instance, in fact, of one of the commands I already showed you. Again, with this word, kill, right there, in front of the word someone that I've highlighted, kill, being specifically about Israelites. And that someone is the word reah, and it specifically means one of your Israelite neighbors. Or does it? Now you might notice what the word means. The word means neighbor or fellow citizen. Now I want to just ask you, can you think of anything in which we are told that neighbor actually doesn't mean one of your fellow Israelites? Isn't that the whole idea behind the Good Samaritan? By the way, the word that the Lord Jesus is referencing in the love your neighbor as yourself, which is what the Good Samaritan is based on in Luke chapter 10, the word is reah. Same word. So, by the way, trying to work this out with our legal brains, it doesn't work. Right? There is a contradiction. And you can't escape it by trying to just say, oh, it's an exception here. Right? This is actually just about Israelites. This doesn't work. We know that this has got to be about more than just Israelites. Now, I want to show you this guy. This is Rabbi Samuel ben Meir. He is also Rashi's grandson, and his superhero name was Rashbam. Now, don't get him confused with the last guy, Rambam. So he is Rashbam. Rashbam. Okay, so here's Rashbam, and here's what he says about it. And you'll note he goes the exception route. This is how he's trying to break it down, because Jews recognized, again, that there is a contradiction here. God says not to kill, and then he tells us to kill. What do we do with this? So here's what Rashbam says. He says, whenever the term ratzach, that's our word, thou shalt not kill, appears, it refers to killing without adequate justification, right? Now, that sentence is messed up. Just think about this. So if you were able to justify, well, here's why I'm killing this person, then it was fine, right? Apparently. So that's what he says. So he says, a deliberate murderer is to be executed, as we know from Numbers 35, verses 15 to 16. That's what it should have said. Anyway, similar verses in 1 Kings 21, verse 19, when King Achav had framed someone resulting in judicial murder, is also included in this definition of lo tartzach. So that's still our word, ratzach. So do not murder. When the terms haragah or matzah are used to describe killing, this means there was no excuse for the killer to commit his act. So what he's saying is, he has this ratzach up there, and he says that word is only ever used when you go out and you just kill somebody because you're mad or you don't have some reason for it. But he says the other words down there, those two terms, haraga or mata, he says those are used when it's like accidental or something like that, when you don't have a justification. So that's what he tries to do. He tries to say, it means specifically you're out to like get somebody. Now, this is his Kuni, that book that we looked at yesterday. He tries to go the same route. He says the expression ratzach is not applicable unless applied to death caused by illegal means. Now, I think that's funny because that's highly circular. Because if God says, do not kill, then death is illegal, right? Or then going out and killing is illegal. So you sort of have a problem in that sentence. But you can see the way that this legal thinking, the problems that this brings, right? How do you deal with this? And here's the rabbis trying to say this, and yet they even start to contradict themselves as they start to go through this, because it just doesn't work. And so in fact, Judaism today has actually recognized that these rabbis were wrong. Right? They said, these guys tried to work out this word and try to say, oh, it's only about Israelites, or it's only about unjustified killing. So this is Rabbi Marty Lokshin, a modern rabbi. And this is what he says. Well, this argument concerning Deuteronomy 4:42 appears reasonable. Rashbam, that's who we looked at a couple slides ago, is ignoring several more problematic cases of the use of the verb ratzach that cannot be solved in this manner. So he says, sure, it works for the ones that he quoted, but there's a bunch that doesn't actually fit the definition. He says it doesn't actually mean murder. It just means kill. No matter what your intentions are. So he acknowledges it's got to mean that. And so you will note that if you pick up an Orthodox translation of the Torah, you will note that Orthodox translators now specifically translate it as, you shall not kill. Because they recognize the word has to just mean kill. It's not murder. It's not about your intentions. It means don't kill anything. Okay, so I like how he ends it. He says, and indeed, Rashbam is silent on this verse. In other words, he can't explain this, so he just leaves it out. Okay, so note that. So this is what happens when you take your law and then you add in exceptions. Here's what you get. Number one, do not kill unless that person broke the law and is liable for capital punishment, or unless that person is a Canaanite. In other words, not an Israelite. Number two, but kill those who kill and who break other laws. And then number three, kill the Canaanites. And then what did you learn? Well, this is what you learn from it. You learn, don't be a murderer. That's a good thing to learn, right? I'll acknowledge that. But that's kind of something you should probably already know. It's not like you need God to give some divine, don't kill people kind of thing. Like that, we should know that, hopefully. But then you learn, make sure to kill people who violate the law, because that's not considered murder, because that's an exception. Now, can you imagine what society would be like that? Because sometimes it's not clear if someone's broken the law or not, which is why we have 43 volumes of the Talmud, right? So if you have somebody saying, that guy broke the law, I'm going to go kill him, then that's a problem, right? That's not going to be good. That is not going to be a highly organized, well-functioning society. And I think a lot of times we look at the law and we're like, oh, this is exactly what you would need to run a society well. And in some ways, I think it looks like it. But when you really start to sit down and think about it, there'd be a lot of challenges here. Now, yes, it would be organized by the judges. It would be organized by Moses. But what about the avenger of blood? Yeah, this was just an individual guy, right? There's tough stuff like this. And then you also have to make sure to kill the Canaanites. So there's a lot of things that just don't fit. Now, again, I think this is interesting. Judaism recognized this. So I want to just read this to you. This is from the Mishnah, which was the predecessor to the Talmud. Here's what it says. Judaism came to the realization that this actually wasn't the principle, because they realized it just didn't fit. It didn't make sense. So it says, a Sanhedrin, that is the Jewish council, that executes a transgressor once in 7 years is characterized as a destructive tribunal. So if you kill one person, it says, in Sanhedrin, in a whole 7 years, they said, you're destructive. Since the Sanhedrin would subject the testimony to exacting scrutiny, it was extremely rare for a defendant to be executed. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, this categorization applies to a Sanhedrin that executes a transgressor once in 70 years. So he says, even if they killed somebody once in 70 years, they're destructive. So he came to this conclusion that God gave these conflicting commands not to get you to say exception, 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 like Rashbam said, but actually to say, wait, God didn't actually want us to do that. Instead, he wanted something else. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva is the big dude, right? This is what I don't mean in size. I mean in, authority. If we had been members of the Sanhedrin, we would have conducted trials in a manner whereby no person would have ever been executed. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, that's actually Gamaliel, by the way, in the Bible, says, in adopting that approach, they too would increase the number of murderers among the Jewish people. The death penalty would lose its deterrent value, as all potential murderers would know that no one is ever executed. So he comes in as the dissenting voice. Gamliel or Gamaliel is actually known as being one of the mean rabbis. So you can see there is a debate here, but Rabbi Akiva is usually the one who wins out. And he says, I'd never execute anybody. That's what I understand the law to mean. So that's interesting, right? So let's just now wrap this up to understand what's actually going on. Well, there's two things really that we've been talking about, and that is killing lawbreakers and killing the Canaanites. We're going to wait until the exhortation to talk about number 2, killing the Canaanites. What was going on there, and how does that actually teach peace? But to discuss and understand killing lawbreakers, I think we actually need to back up and not look at killing at all. Instead, we need to look at this commandment, which is our namesake for this class. Exodus 21, verses 23 to 25, it says, but if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. And so you can see in this, God once again is commanding what? He's commanding to kill. Violence, right? And again, this should have caused the people to say, wait, what's this really about? To step back and to ask about that. Now, he goes on and he gives even more detail in the next book. Leviticus 21, verses 17 to 21 says, anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. Again, right? Taking life. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. Whoever kills an animal must make restitution, but whoever kills a human being is to be put to death. Now, again, we sometimes approach this and we say, oh, this would make it so that in society, nobody would do anything against the other person. That is not true. And the way that we know that's not true is because the Jewish nation stopped doing this because they said it doesn't work. Now, let me tell you what I mean. In the Talmud, they explain how they have decided to interpret this because eye for an eye didn't stop violence. Anybody know what they did instead? They imposed a system of fines. They said, how much is an eye worth? You have to pay that much. How much is a leg worth? You have to pay that much, right? And they went through all the different things. How much is a tooth worth? You have to pay that much. So they created this system of fines because they found that this didn't work. This didn't deter people. And instead of deterring people, you know what it did? It made a lot of people really hurt. Right? Because this is how things work. When you're angry, does eye for an eye make things better? No. You just say, you know what? I'm going to go punch that guy, and then I'm going to run away so he can't punch me back. Right? Like that's often how it goes. You've probably heard before, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. By the way, you maybe have heard that attributed to Gandhi. That's actually a false attribution. It was actually Gandhi's biographer. So there you go. Anyway, okay. So I throw a couple of these up here because again, I think we forget about this, right? Like this is where eye for an eye goes. So eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right? You get this, and like clearly neither of these guys have really won. Like this is the problem. If you hit somebody, guess what they want to do? They want to hit you back. And then when they hit you back, what do you want to do? Hit them back, right? And this is what continues going on. Here's another one for you. Conflict in the Middle East is all based on an eye for an eye. If they take an eye, we take an eye. If they take a tooth, we take a tooth. If they continue, we'll continue until we're absolutely sure they have learned their lesson. And here's a guy with no more eyes and no more teeth. So I just put that out, and you might think, well, that's silly. I mean, come on, it doesn't really go that way. But this is very much how things happen, right? This is how human psychology works. So this is an academic article called Eye for an Eye, Neural Correlates of Retribution and Forgiveness, right? It was published in 2013. This was a study in which participants were taken to play a game. And in this game, here's what they did. They were given the opportunity to steal all of someone's money. Now, after they did this, the roles were then reversed. And the person who had all their money stolen was asked, okay, what would you like to do? Do you want to forgive that person? Or do you want to steal all their money? Now, you can probably figure out the choice that people made, right? Eye for an eye often leads to, then I'll take their eye too, right? And this was the whole idea. It's the same thing here. This is also called Eye for an Eye, a meta-analysis of negative reciprocity in organizations. This was done in 2019. Study came to the same conclusions, that in a workplace in which you are allowed retribution, there is significantly more retribution in the workplace, and it doesn't turn out good. Now, you might be thinking, well, fine, then why did God command that? Well, God commanded it for the same reason that he commanded the other commands. Because he wanted the people to say, wait a minute, this isn't right? This contradicts other stuff. We aren't supposed to take life for life. You told us not to. So I would suggest to you, by the way, anybody know where eye for an eye came from? It's a quote. It's a quote from the Laws of Hammurabi. I think this is awesome. The Laws of Hammurabi clearly existed before the Law of Moses. Moses quotes, by divine inspiration, the Laws of Hammurabi. Why? I would suggest to you to show that they don't work. I think that's the point. God says, you know what? You have permission to do this. And that's what we saw with the stoning adulterers. You have permission to do this. But what did God want his people to do rather than stone the adulterers? Joseph, being a just man, was resolved to put her away quietly. He didn't want them to stone the adulterers. He wanted them to say, I forgive you. Now go out and live differently. And that's the exact scenario. Can you imagine how powerful it would be when you have eye for an eye? Everybody knows this is the Law of Hammurabi, and you have eye for an eye hanging over you, and you know you just hurt your neighbor, or you just broke his arm or whatever, and he has every right under the law to come break your arm, and your neighbor comes up to you and says, you know what? I forgive you. Think about the impact that would have. And I would suggest to you that's what God was getting at with the law. He says, I am giving you permission to do eye for an eye, but I want you to choose the better way. That's free will, right? The principle is that vengeance doesn't work. And that is why God says throughout the law, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people. How does eye for an eye fit with that? Proverbs 20, verse 22. Do not say, I'll pay you back for this wrong. In other words, don't say eye for an eye. That's a contradiction, isn't it? But that's because God was trying to get them to realize that doesn't work. And he wanted them to choose forgiveness, peace instead. Now, if you're a little skeptical of this, you might be thinking, I don't know about that. You know, I've always thought eye for an eye, maybe it's a good system or something like that. I don't know what you might be thinking with that. But consider, this is actually the interpretation that the Lord Jesus gives to eye for an eye. Did you ever notice this? He brings it up in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 42. Here's what he says. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Do you see what just happened? The Lord Jesus says, Eye for an eye, let me tell you what that really means. It means you do the opposite. So, when we look at thou shalt not kill, I think this was supposed to create this moral question within the Israelites. They were supposed to say, wait a minute, how does this all fit? How is it that you're telling us to kill the lawbreakers and yet you tell us not to kill? How does this work? And then they go the exception route and they realize the exceptions don't work. It just creates more loopholes and things don't fit. And instead, what he wanted them to see was, in fact, when he gave them permission to kill, the right thing, the better thing, was to choose the method of peace. Now, I'm not saying that means just let everything go, but it meant saying to the person, we have permission to kill you, but we're not going to, because we want to help you change. That's the whole idea. This is he who is without sin, let him cast the first stone. This is how it all fits. And yet we often come and we solely read the command. And what we should be doing is asking, what's the principle beneath this? And recognizing that the entire law is summed up in love your neighbor as yourself. From the very beginning, our God has been the same. It's not one God of the Old Testament, one God of the New, a God of violence and a God of peace. But from the very beginning, he has been a God of peace. And the big challenge has been the fact that we just haven't seen it.
If you found this video helpful, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment below and let us know what you thought. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.